Imagine a fighter plane that nobody wanted. A machine so misunderstood, so disliked by the very country that built it, that hundreds of them sat in storage, collecting dust. To the Americans, it was an embarrassment. To the British, it was dangerous. And yet, thousands of miles away, another nation would take this failure, strap in their bravest young men, and unleash it against one of the deadliest air forces the world had ever seen. That nation was the Soviet Union. That plane was the Bell P-39 Airacobra, and its story didn't end there. Its successor, the P-63 Kingcobra, would follow the same path. Dismissed in the West, reborn in the East, and forever etched into the bloody skies of the Eastern Front. What we're about to uncover is not just the tale of airplanes, but of desperation, adaptation, and survival. This is the chronicle of how America's leftovers became Soviet legends. When Bell Aircraft introduced the P-39 Airacobra in 1939, it was supposed to be a game changer. Its futuristic design placed the engine in the center of the fuselage, behind the pilot. Something no major U.S. fighter had ever attempted. It had car-style doors instead of the traditional sliding canopy, and its nose carried a monstrous 37-dembered cannon capable of blowing enemy bombers to pieces. On paper, but war is not fought on paper. In reality, the P-39's biggest flaw was its lack of a turbo supercharger. Unlike the P-38 Lightning or P-51 Mustang, the Airacobra couldn't climb to the high altitudes where most battles over Europe raged. British pilots tested it, hated it, and sent it back. American pilots gave it a chance but quickly relegated it to training duties or second-line squadrons. To the U.S. military, the Airacobra was not a knight of the skies. It was a dead end, yet history has a way of giving rejects a second life. By June 1941, Nazi Germany's Operation Barbarossa had ripped into the Soviet Union like a storm of steel and fire. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, hammering Red Army positions and destroying Soviet aircraft by the hundreds. Moscow was desperate. Factories were being bombed. Pilots were dying in droves, and the Soviets needed modern fighters, fast. Stalin turned to his uneasy allies, Britain and the United States, for help. Under the Lend-Lease program, Washington had to decide what to send. But let's be honest, America wasn't about to ship its precious Mustangs, Thunderbolts, or Corsairs. Instead, it sent what it considered second-rate, the P-40 Warhawk, the Douglas A-20 Havoc, and yes, thousands of those unwanted Bell P-39 Airacobras. To American generals, it was like handing off spare parts. To Soviet pilots, it was a lifeline in the middle of an inferno. Here's the twist. The very weaknesses that doomed the P-39 in Western skies made it perfect for the Soviet battlefield. Unlike the Americans and British, who fought at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, Soviet air battles often took place at low altitudes, sometimes barely above the treetops. This was the realm of brutal, close-range dogfights and ground attack missions. At these altitudes, the Airacobra was a beast. Its mid-engine layout gave it stability. Its tricycle landing gear made it easy to operate from rough, muddy Soviet airfields, and its nose-mounted 37-bomber cannon, which American pilots found slow and unwieldy, was devastating against German Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and even tanks. Suddenly, the Soviet Air Force had a fighter that matched its battlefield realities. This, reject, became the perfect predator, tailored not by design but by circumstance to the Eastern Front's deadly skies. As convoys of P-39s made their way across the Atlantic and through the dangerous Alaska, Siberia ferry route, they entered the bloodiest air war in history. In Soviet hands, the Airacobra became a killer. Pilots like Alexander Pokryshkin, who would go on to become the second highest scoring Soviet ace of the war, scored the majority of their kills flying P-39s. German Luftwaffe pilots, who once mocked the aircraft, now found themselves blown out of the sky by its devastating cannon. The Airacobra wasn't perfect. It was never meant to be. But it gave the Red Air Force the edge it needed at a time when every battle could decide the fate of a nation. By war's end, Soviet P-39s accounted for tens of thousands of aerial victories. America may have seen the Airacobra as a failure, but in Russia, it was immortalized as a legend, and the story was far from over, because its successor, the P-63 Kingcobra, was waiting in the wings. Getting the Airacobra into Soviet hands was no small task. These planes didn't just magically appear over Moscow or Stalingrad. They had to travel through some of the most dangerous supply routes in the world. One of the key arteries was the Arctic convoys, which sailed from Britain and the United States to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. These ships braved freezing temperatures, constant storms, and relentless attacks from German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers. Many never made it, but the most daring route was the Alaska-Siberia ferry, known as ALSI-B. Here, American pilots flew P-39s from Great Falls, Montana, up through Alaska, across the icy Bering Strait, and into Siberia, where Soviet pilots would take over. It was a journey through snow, ice, and sheer death risk, but it delivered over 700 Airacobras into Soviet hands. Without this lifeline, the Soviets might never have received enough fighters to contest the Luftwaffe. Every Airacobra that made the trip was a symbol of survival, not just for the plane, but for the Soviet war effort itself. If the Airacobra had one true champion, it was Alexander Pokryshkin, a Soviet pilot who would go on to become one of the most decorated aces in history. Pokryshkin found in the P-39 the perfect partner for his aggressive style of combat. Where others saw a clumsy, underpowered fighter, he saw precision, stability, and raw firepower. Flying the P-39, Pokryshkin racked up more than 48 confirmed victories, though his real total was likely much higher. He rewrote Soviet air combat tactics, emphasizing altitude control, surprise, and teamwork. His philosophy was simple: height, speed, maneuver, fire. In his hands, the Airacobra was no leftover. It was a scalpel. Pokryshkin's fame spread throughout the Red Air Force, inspiring other pilots to master the Cobra. For the Germans, hearing that Pokryshkin was in the sky was enough to raise fear. By the war's end, he became the second highest scoring Soviet ace, and the Airacobra was forever tied to his legend. Pokryshkin wasn't alone. Dozens of Soviet aces made their reputations in P-39s. Grigory Rekalov scored 61 kills, most of them in Airacobras. Nikolai Gulayev added 57. Even the famous Lydia Litviak, one of the world's most successful female fighter pilots, trained on P-39s during her career. For these men and women, the Airacobra wasn't just a machine, it was an equalizer. Against the technologically advanced Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Ft-190s, the P-39 gave them a fighting chance. Its cannon could tear apart a German aircraft with a single well-placed hit, and its rugged design could take punishment and keep flying. In Soviet propaganda, the Airacobra quickly shifted from being seen as Western scrap to the fighter of heroes. Soviet pilots painted fierce nose art, gave their Cobras nicknames, and flew them with a pride that shocked even the Americans. By embracing this unwanted plane, the Soviets proved that skill and strategy could turn any tool into a weapon of legend. One of the Airacobra's most underrated strengths was its ability to double as a ground attack aircraft. The Eastern Front wasn't just about air-to-air duels. It was about stopping German tanks, trucks, and infantry columns from overwhelming Soviet defenses. At low altitudes, the P-39's 37mm cannon and a .50 caliber machine guns were devastating. A single burst could shred armored vehicles, blast artillery positions, or decimate convoys. German soldiers learned to fear the flying cannon as it swooped low over the battlefield. Unlike the American doctrine, which emphasized escorting bombers, Soviet pilots treated the Airacobra as a multi-role war machine. It wasn't unusual for a squadron of P-39s to strafe ground targets in the morning and engage Messerschmitts in the afternoon. The Luftwaffe had no such flexibility, and this adaptability helped the Soviets grind down the German war machine. In many ways, the P-39 became the Soviet version of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Tough, reliable, and brutally effective against both planes and tanks. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union had received over 700 P-39 Airacobras, more than any other Allied nation, and unlike the Americans, who barely used them in combat, the Soviets flew them relentlessly. More than half of all P-39s ever built ended up fighting under the Red Star, and the results were staggering. Soviet pilots flying Airacobras accounted for thousands upon thousands of confirmed kills. In fact, the majority of the top Soviet aces scored most of their victories in P-39s, not Soviet-built fighters. This fact alone speaks volumes. A plane dismissed in the West became the backbone of Soviet air supremacy. Even when the newer Yakovlev and Lavochkin fighters entered service, many Soviet pilots chose to stick with their beloved Cobras. It was a strange twist of fate. America's unwanted stepchild had become Russia's champion, and just when the story seemed complete, the P-63 Kingcobra arrived to take things even further. By 1943, the Soviets had fallen in love with the P-39, but America wasn't done building Cobras. Bell Aircraft was already working on an improved version, the P-63 Kingcobra. On the surface, it looked similar to the Airacobra, but under the skin, it was a very different beast. It had a redesigned laminar flow wing, improved armor, a bigger engine, and the same monstrous 37mm cannon. In short, the Kingcobra was the P-39's bigger, meaner brother. Once again, the U.S. Army Air Forces wasn't particularly interested. By now, the Mustang and the Thunderbolt dominated American doctrine. But for the Soviets, the P-63 was exactly what they needed, a low-altitude brawler that could shred German planes and smash armored targets. And so, in one of history's great ironies, the successor to America's unwanted fighter became a prized gift to their most unlikely ally. To understand why the Soviets got thousands of P-63s while the Americans barely touched them, we need to look at doctrine. The U.S. Air Force had shifted its entire strategy around long-range bomber escort. They needed fighters that could climb to 25,000, 30,000 feet and protect B-17s and B-24s all the way to Berlin and back. The P-63, despite being more advanced than the P-39, still wasn't great at high-altitude performance. Its powerful engine gave it speed, but without a turbo supercharger, it could never rival a Mustang in the thin air above Europe. So American generals pushed it aside. They ordered thousands, but almost all went straight into storage or into crates bound for Soviet ports. For the Americans, the P-63 was a backup plan at best. For the Soviets, it was a frontline weapon. This mismatch of needs would once again turn American leftovers into Soviet legends. When the first P-63s reached Soviet airfields, pilots were stunned. Compared to their older P-39s, the Kingcobra felt like a true evolution. It was faster, more durable, and had improved visibility for the pilot. Most importantly, it still carried that fearsome 37mm cannon which Soviet pilots had mastered. On the Eastern Front, where battles were fought close to the ground, the P-63 was deadly. Luftwaffe aircraft like the Fu-190 and Bf-109 still threats, but by 1944, Germany was weakening, and the Red Air Force had numbers on its side. With Kingcobras joining the fight, Soviet pilots gained yet another tool to dominate low-altitude combat. Some even began using the P-63 for dedicated tank-busting missions, turning German armor columns into flaming wrecks. For Soviet soldiers on the ground, the roar of a Kingcobra overhead was the sound of salvation. Here's a little-known twist. While the Soviets were happily flying their Kingcobras, the Americans quietly avoided mentioning it. Officially, the P-63 was never used in combat by U.S. forces during World War II. Unofficially, Washington knew very well that the Soviets were flying them against the Germans. After the war ended, hundreds of Kingcobras remained in Soviet service, and they didn't just vanish. They were used during the early Cold War years, guarding the USSR's skies, and even being tested against captured German jets. Some historians believe that Soviet engineers borrowed design cues from the P-63 when developing their own fighters in the late 1940s. In other words, America's cast-off machine may have indirectly influenced the very jets that would later face the West in Korea. It was another irony, second-rate, fighters shaping the early Cold War battlefield. When the dust settled after World War II, the story of the Cobras, both Airacobra and Kingcobra, stood as one of the strangest twists in aviation history. America built them, hated them, and gave them away. The Soviets took them, mastered them, and turned them into tools of survival. For Alexander Pokryshkin and other Soviet aces, the Airacobra wasn't a leftover. It was the machine that carried them to glory. For ground troops, It was the plane that saved lives by smashing German tanks and convoys, and for post-war Soviet aviation, the P-63 gave a technological bridge toward the jet age. In the West, these planes are often forgotten, overshadowed by the Mustang and Spitfire. But in Russia, the Cobra remains a symbol of ingenuity, adaptation, and the strange reality of war. Sometimes the weapons nobody wants become the ones that win battles. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had learned the hard way to respect the Cobra. At first, German pilots mocked the P-39 as second-rate and believed it couldn't stand up to their Bf-109s or F-190s. But on the Eastern Front, reality told a different story. Soviet pilots flying Cobras racked up staggering kill counts. The 37-mm cannon could slice through German aircraft like a hot knife through butter. And at the low altitudes where most battles happened, the Cobra's maneuverability was more than enough. German intelligence reports began to take note, warning that Soviet units flying American fighters were particularly dangerous. In a way, the Luftwaffe's shift in attitude was the ultimate compliment. A machine the West discarded was now considered one of the most feared weapons in the East. This transformation wasn't about the airplane alone. It was about the pilots who discovered how to unleash its full potential. To truly understand the legend of the Cobra, we have to step inside the cockpit with a Soviet pilot in 1943. Imagine strapping into a machine that feels unlike any Soviet aircraft. You don't climb into it. You open a car-style door and sit inside like you're entering a vehicle. The engine rumbles behind you, shaking the seat. Ahead, the long nose houses that monstrous cannon, ready to fire a shell bigger than most fighter plane bullets. On takeoff, the tricycle landing gear gives you surprising stability, even from rough, muddy runways. In combat, you dive into a swirling dogfight, your eyes scanning for the black cross of a German fighter. You pull the trigger, and a single 37mm shell rips through an enemy plane, sending it tumbling in flames. In that moment, you don't care that Americans called this plane a reject. To you, it is a savior. That's why so many Soviet pilots soar by their Cobras until the war's very end. After 1945, the Airacobra and Kingcobra faded quietly from American memory. In the U.S., the Mustang was celebrated as the war-winning fighter, while the Thunderbolt and Lightning became icons of American air power. The P-39 and P-63, they were footnotes, often dismissed as failed experiments. But in the Soviet Union, the legacy lived on. Veterans who flew Cobras told stories of survival, of victories against the Luftwaffe, of how these foreign machines turned the tide in countless battles. Western historians ignored these accounts for decades, focusing on Spitfires, Mustangs, and Messerschmitts. Only recently have aviation experts begun to re-examine the Eastern Front and realize just how crucial these American fighters were. History had almost forgotten the Cobras, but the pilots who flew them never did. Looking back, the story of the P-39 and P-63 is full of irony. America designed them, dismissed them, and gave them away. The Soviets, desperate and determined, turned them into legends. Without these aircraft, the Red Air Force might not have gained the air superiority it needed in 1943 and 1944. Without them, pilots like Pokryshkin might never have risen to glory. And without them, the Eastern Front could have looked very different. The Cobra story reminds us that war is not always won with the perfect weapon. Sometimes, it's won with the weapon that's available, the one that fits the unique circumstances of the battlefield. Even if others call it a failure, the Airacobra and Kingcobra weren't America's stars. But in Soviet skies, they became legends carved in blood and steel. So the next time you hear someone talk about the greatest fighters of World War II, the Mustang, the Spitfire, the Messerschmitt, remember the Cobra. Remember the plane America didn't want but the Soviet Union couldn't live without. Remember the pilots who climbed into those cockpits against all odds and turned leftovers into legends. The story of the P-39 Airacobra and P-63 Kingcobra isn't just about airplanes. It's about resilience, adaptation, and the strange twists of history that decide who wins and who loses. These fighters may have been forgotten in the West, but in Russia they remain immortal. And perhaps, in their story, we learn a lesson of our own: never underestimate the underdog. Because sometimes the underdog wins wars.